Now I'm going to try to make you understand as much as possible, as simply as possible. The four aspects of man, their relationship of mechanisms between his ego, his personality, the soul and the thought adjuster. So that one day you may come to understand precisely and easily see the action, the activity of these four attributes of man. First you have to understand that the ego, what you call the ego, the self, what people are trying to achieve as being the most personal to themselves. Then the name we give to this part of the man we call the ego, is the part that vibrates, feels, acts and reacts, loves, does not love, cries, does not cry, hate, does not hate. Then this part of yourself must one day be dominated by the forces of the soul. The forces of the soul are very great, and when they begin to penetrate the ego realizes it. It is as if there is another will behind the activities of the ego that he cannot control. It is a will that is stronger than he is. It is a will that eventually leads him to even rebel as much as it is strong. But this force, which is the strength of the soul, must one day come to dominate the ego. Because it is the divine part of man. It is the part of man that is not under the influence of luciferic forces. It is the part of man that is not under the influence of forms. It is the pure part, it is the crystal in man. The ego itself, when it begins to be sensitive to these forces, often it finds it hard, often it suffers, often it is unhappy, because it has an automatic resistance to these forces. That's normal. But the forces of the soul, when they begin to penetrate more and more. So that eventually the ego is more and more illuminated by these energies. But the ego, he must understand what is happening. He must be able to evaluate what is happening within him psychologically, when the forces of the soul begin to penetrate him and then transform him. So what is going to explain to the ego what is going on? It's the thought adjuster. But the ego, he doesn't know that when he thinks, it's the thought adjuster who thinks behind him. Because the ego is an illusion, that when he thinks it is he who thinks. The ego is centered on itself. Then, all of a sudden, the forces of the soul begin to penetrate him. There is need for orientation, he needs to have what is happening, then there is a being who can explain to him what is happening in himself, and that is the thought adjuster. So at that moment it is very important for the ego to understand, that when he thinks who thinks anything, there is always the thought adjuster behind him who thinks. But as the ego is not yet at the beginning at a high level of fusion with the thought adjuster, his thoughts are not right, his thoughts are not precise, his thoughts are deharmonized. Because his thoughts are contaminated by all kinds of thoughts, which exist in the mental plane of man and come from everywhere. This is how the ego has been used for years to thinking with everyone's thoughts. And everyone's thoughts have become his center of reflection, instead of him having his own center of perception. Do you understand? Instead of thinking right, in other words, instead of his thoughts being directly related to the vibration that is emitted by the thought adjuster in his mind, called the supramental, these thoughts are thoughts that therefore come from his experiential contact with his mental activity, with books, with communications between him and other people. So that at a certain moment in life, the ego no longer thinks these thoughts, that is, only thoughts, the original energy that comes from the thought adjuster and tries to imprint itself in the mind of man, are completely ineffective because the ego has accumulated material everywhere, in all sources, then returned at some point this material to completely cover the background, that is, its natural contact with the thought adjuster. So don't ask yourself why it's absolutely impossible for you people in general to be able to communicate with your thought adjuster at your age. To have a natural, informative and intelligent telepathic communication. Then the situation of the ego is a natural situation of involution because, at a given moment in his life, he is no longer able to know himself, he is able to learn knowledge, because he has memory, but he is no longer able to know himself. Because in order to know himself, you have to be in contact with the thought adjuster. So imagine then that people meet someone who explains to them how it works, And then of course the rest of them would like the work that has been done for years to cut the bridge between the ego and the thought adjuster. They would like it to be done to them all of a sudden, all of a sudden. Let me tell you, if it were all in a shot, you couldn't take it, you'd crack and then we'd get you back to the big building. He, the thought adjuster, knows, understands, knows how it works. He knows that the work must be done gradually over the next few years, until the day the contact between you, between your ego and him is re-established, and then everything begins again in a normal state. Then the ego itself must understand one thing. He must understand that his thoughts are not his thoughts. Behind every form of thought, whether good or bad, there is always the energy of the thought adjuster. If the ego understands that the thought is good or that the thought is bad, that there is always the energy of the thought adjuster behind this thought there, at that moment, he learns an extremely important thing. It is never to take these good or bad thoughts seriously. That is, he must never take these thoughts upon himself. He must live these thoughts. He must listen to them, these thoughts. And little by little, with this decentralizing of these thoughts, he will allow the thought adjuster to change the polarity of his mental body. In this way, over time, negative thoughts and then positive thoughts, in other words the polarity of the mental body, which results from the very nature of the form, will be destroyed. So that in the mental body there will be no more positive and then no more negative, there will simply be pure consciousness. There, at that moment, the ego can breathe. Because, at that moment, everything that happens in his mind is totally pre-personal. That is, what happens in his mind is cosmic and passes through the mind to enlighten it. Then the ego at this point of its evolution, no longer has any psychological problem, because it is no longer taken with good and then evil. There is no longer a philosophical problem because he is no longer in the search for truth, he is simply in vibratory communication with the energy of the thought adjuster who instructs him and lets him understand what he must understand. So at that moment, life for the ego is extremely simple. Knowledge is established, the mad rush to the truth and then to knowledge has ceased, then the ego begins to live. But the ego, there is another matter with him, it is that he has a personality. His personality is not always a gift. Because, as the soul must dominate the ego must come to dominate its personality. So what does it do, that famous personality there? Personality is the color of the ego projected into the material. It is the color of the ego and the color that the ego takes, when because of the material body, the physical body, it is forced to undergo external material influences. The ego is not always able to fully appreciate the material personality, because the material personality was created for very particular reasons that are directly related to the evolution of the ego. If you have an ego that is in a physical body, then the physical body that is missing a leg, that is all crooked, that is not beautiful, but at that moment the ego, it does not have the same relationship with its personality as if its physical body is beautiful, tall, beautiful blue eyes, beautiful blonde hair. So the relationship between the ego and personality is a relationship that can be very difficult. But if the ego itself is enlightened by the energy of the soul, then instructed by the thought adjuster, at that moment the physical aspect of the world, the physical aspect of its own world, of its manifestation in the world which is its personality, becomes less important, he suffers less. And it is necessary that the ego does not suffer from its personality. It is necessary that the ego comes to take its personality as it is and to be well in its personality, but for it to be well in its personality, the ego, it must know what is happening, in its own reality to itself. So if the ego is well dominated by the soul, then that is well instructed by the thought adjuster, but at that time, the personality will follow, then the ego gradually will dominate the personality. So that the personality will no longer have a depressive influence on him and there will be direct communication, an axis of formation, a unitary axis between the soul, the ego and then the personality. Then with the thought adjuster who instructs the ego, and at that moment the ego makes a life. lives a life at the level of himself that is real and in relation to the personality, that becomes the support of his creative activity, instead of being the cannonball that must fire for a whole lifetime. So it is very important for people to understand first the relationship between the soul and the ego, and then the thought adjuster and the ego. When you have understood, when you have felt the vibrations of the soul, then when you have heard in your mind, when you can communicate in your mind with the thought adjuster, when you have realized that your thoughts are not your thoughts, in other words, are not his thoughts, then it will be easy for you people to solve the problem of your personalities. So don't worry about your personalities, let them be your personalities. Your personalities will settle down on their own. What is most important for you people is to understand the phenomenon of your thoughts. To let your thoughts pass through your head, to listen to your thoughts, not to attach yourself to the polarity of your thoughts. To realize that your thoughts are an energy that comes from the adjuster and that he, little by little, will organize himself to change them and make them more and more impersonal. So that one day you will realize that there is someone talking to you. That there is an intelligence that is in communication with you people. That there's an intelligence trying to make you understand something. And at that moment the energy of the soul, which will penetrate your ego, the thought adjuster who will try to educate you, will totally eliminate the imbalance that exists between you, your ego and your personality. Don't worry about your personality, it will settle itself. It is at the level of your ego that you will suffer. It is at the level of your ego that you will find this difficult. If your ego succeeds in settling, if your ego succeeds in letting the energy of the soul pass through, if your ego learns to understand its thoughts and to detach itself from its thoughts, if your ego learns to stop analyzing itself, which is its great attachment to its thoughts, at that moment everything else, your personality that is simply, the vehicle of the ego, as the ego is the vehicle of the soul will settle. There are some of you who are afraid at the level of your ego or who suffer at the level of your ego, of being influenced by negative forces. Some are influenced by negative forces. That is, there are other dead egos, trying to influence them. Well, listen to me carefully, if you learn not to attach yourself to your thoughts, these forces will eventually no longer have powers over your ego. Because these forces will realize that your ego has understood one thing, it is not to attach themselves to the form of thoughts, which they use to create tensions for you. That's why I'm telling you that you're attached to positive forms or negative forms, it's the same thing. What is important for you people is to finally understand that you must not be attached to anything in your mind. Neither positive nor negative forms. To allow thoughts to pass until the day when these thoughts will gradually change, transform themselves, because, not attaching yourself to them, the thought adjuster will be able to fill your mind with another energy so that eventually neither the negative nor the positive will be able to affect you. The key in this is not to get attached to your thoughts. So it's not immediately that these negative thoughts will stop harassing you. It will be done gradually, but it must be done because the law of thoughts, is a law that is very, very universal. That's how it works. But as long as you attach yourself to your thoughts, at that moment you give these negative intelligences there, which use negative thought forms as much as possible to create problems for you. On Earth right now in our time there is a phenomenon that is beyond everyone's comprehension and is being perpetrated. It is that humanity is receiving energies of very high vibrations in its lower mind. And the people who suffer most from these energies are the most evolved, the most sensitive people. There are some among these people who will not be able to suffer the penetration of these energies there. Some will even commit suicide, some will break down. That is why the suicide rate, the rate of mental illness, is increasing every day, especially in the industrialized worlds. In the big cities. But among these men and women who receive these energies of high vibrations, there are some who will be able to absorb them. And these energies will totally transform their inner lives. But these men must have information, must understand what is happening to be able to absorb these energies and allow these energies to become an asset for them instead of a liability. So you people are in this situation. You are one of those men and women who receive these energies, but you have a special opportunity to understand what is happening. The ego, it's like a hunter who's always running after with two rabbits, but he's running with only one. The ego, it always runs the rabbit of knowledge, the rabbit of knowingness. It does not see it. I'm telling you, there are two rabbits. There is the rabbit of knowledge and then the rabbit of knowingness. Then, the rabbit of knowingness is more important than the rabbit of knowledge. One day, you have to understand that. Then there are some of you who are much more interested in the knowledge rabbit than the knowingness rabbit. Because, there are some of you who have gone far in the search for knowledge. That's your ego looking for that rabbit. I will tell you one thing, over time your ego will understand that the rabbit of knowingness is your contact with the thought adjuster. The rabbit of knowledge is part of your personal desires, the desire of your ego, to accumulate more and more interesting thought forms, to perfect what it believes, as the ultimate aspect of evolution. But let me tell you something, you put your finger in your eye. There is nothing there to knowledge, because knowledge contains knowledge. Knowingness is in the total relationship between your ego and your soul. It is your soul that knows, your ego seeks to understand but your soul knows. Then when there will be a very close link between your ego and then your soul, and at that moment your ego will be in the knowingness, then at that moment you will be totally individualized, totally autonomous. You will be beings who will no longer need support outside of yourself. At that moment you will be comfortable in your own skin. So think about doing it from the two-rabbit race. Change your vision a little and realize that the rabbit of the knowledge is an illusion. A beautiful illusion, a great illusion. Besides, this rabbit is part of your evolution. But I'm telling you, and I know it, there's another rabbit you don't see. And that rabbit there, who is the rabbit of knowingness, is that rabbit there that you must eventually know. And I give you the way to get to know him. During the changes, the transformations that will take place in you that will bring you to consciousness, you will realize that what you want is not necessarily what they want at the top. And if what the rest of them upstairs want, that's important. Because what they want is perfect. And what they want is necessary for the transmutation of your ego. So what will happen is that there will be a fight between your ego and what they want at the top. And from this fight your ego will develop a kind of power, a kind of will. A will you've never known before. A will that is based on the energy of the soul. And this willingness will become greater and greater. So that one day when the consciousness will be very settled in you, the will of your ego will be the same as the will of the mothers at the top. So that he will have a balance, a unity, a bond. But until then, what you people want, what they want up there want, is two different pairs of sleeves. Then you will understand what I mean. In fact, some of you already understand what I mean. Then realize that this conflict between your ego and them, it is a conflict that comes from the work they do on your ego. To change the vibrations of your mental body, to change the vibrations of your emotional body, to change the vibrations of your etheric body, and to change the vibrations of your physical body. So it's an in-depth work. So if you people want a few things, then they want other things, they will win. Because, they are the force. And little by little, when your ego will become better and better, that is, more and more perfect in their light. When your ego will understand more and more its relationship with the mothers, when your ego will be filled more and more with the energy of the soul, which is the seat of your true will, at that moment your ego will only have a will, then it will be a powerful one. Then it is at that moment that your ego will be able to control its destiny. But before you can use this energy of the soul, they will have to cleanse your ego and machine it. And the passage from your ego to the washing machine, it is you, your ego, that will live it, and that is your suffering. If you understand the mechanism of suffering, If you understand that suffering is the result of the contact between your ego and the vibratory forces of very great light that try to penetrate your ego, to transform it, to bring it to its right color, its natural color, at that moment you will learn not to take your ego seriously. Then it's subtle, it seems, just words, not to take your ego seriously. But one day, you will understand that not taking your ego seriously is a state of mind. Then when you don't take your ego seriously, you don't take anything seriously. Then when you don't take anything seriously, you don't suffer from anything. That's exactly where they're going to hold you. Because, we gradually learn not to take ourselves seriously. It is gradually that the ego begins to understand the game, which exists between him and the mothers. It is the forces of light that drive the universe. Then the ego, when he begins to understand that everything is a game between him and the mothers, to bring man to a high level of vibratory resonance with the forces of light. At this moment the ego is fine. That's where life is easy, where life is simple. But I understand you if you tell me, but yes, but now I'm sick of it. This I'll give you. That I understand you, if you tell me, I am sick of suffering, I understand you. Because I've been through it too, I've been through it. But what happens is that, when you have reached a point where you are not really full of that, when you are really sick of suffering, at that moment what happens is that you descend the energy of the soul into your mind and there you apply your will. And now let me tell you that it works. But until you are able to bring this energy from the soul down into your mind, you are not able to put the axe. Then it is when you have learned to put the axe with the energy of the soul, not an axe that comes from the reaction of the ego to an external situation. I mean to put the axe, I mean to descend the energy of the soul into your mind and take that energy there and act. As long as you are not able to do this, you are automatically subject to left and right blows. Then one day you will understand exactly what I mean. And at that moment you will no longer be able to suffer for nothing, to suffer from an external situation for nothing because your ego takes itself seriously. Then when your ego is powerful, when it is in power because it is filled with the energies of the soul, then it has the intelligence of action because of its contact with the thought adjuster. Let me say that when you make a decision it will be made, and then it will always be made in relation to the laws of evolution. For the evolution of man, for the evolution of society and for the well-being of your personalities, your bodies and your souls. In other words, for the well-being of yourself. Notice one thing, I repeat. What they do in their penetration work to transmute your bodies is not what you people in your little egos will necessarily want. Then that's normal, it's absolutely normal. You're no longer here, at a knowledge research internship. It's easy to seek knowledge, you go to a master, then he tells you beautiful things, then it's pleasant, then it works. You read beautiful books, it's fun, it works. There, it is more spirituality there, you are more in a phase of spirituality, you are in a phase of body transformation. Where the stage of spirituality is already being surpassed. There, it is reality. Then reality is greater than spirituality. Then reality is a situation of energy between a material plane and invisible planes. Then remember one thing, nobody is the same. The way they're going to operate with one of you, then the way they're going to operate with another, then another, then another, then another, is different. No two beings are the same, no two. If they operate in a certain way with a person, it is their experience. Take care of your experience. There are always those who tend to compare themselves to others. Do not compare yourself to others. Live your experience within your experience. Don't worry about other people's experience. When I speak, I am obliged to speak generally, I speak for everyone. But the rest of you, when you try to understand what I'm saying, understand it, within your own experience. Besides, what I'm saying is good for everyone. But differently for everyone. I love you, because I can't do otherwise. I'm made like that, I have that kind of consciousness there. But you people, Organize yourself to appreciate each other too. Realize that there is not one of you who has the right to think or believe that you are more evolved than others, because consciousness is universal, it is universal consciousness. Whether you are simple or well-educated in esotericism, the conscience doesn't care as it did in the year 40. So be careful. There are some of you who seem to be very simple, who don't seem to ask many questions, who don't seem to have this kind of intelligence. Be careful. Consciousness is universal. Make sure you like each other. Then to see beyond your belly button. Because they're waiting for you up there. Then they will organize the dial for you to take you to be universal. That is to say, to be able to have conscious relationships, especially with people who are on the way to penetrating consciousness. Because for the rest of them, this case is a big buffer. It's a big patent in every country in the world. All men who enter consciousness must one day be of the same consciousness. So listen to me carefully, learn to appreciate each other. I understand that you may not be able to love yourself consciously yet for everyone. Because you are still too much in the light of your ego, then your ego is still struggling with itself and then getting out of its mists. But realizing that the smallest among you people is as important as the guy next door. Be careful with that. Love is important. I am not talking about spiritual love, I am talking about the consciousness which is love.